Episode 3. The Secret Manual of Vạn Kiep. The Art of Warfare. When the words sat that were carved into the arms of Đại Việt soldiers, they were not merely a promise before battle. They marked the moment an entire nation transformed fear into willpower and turned its smallness before the most powerful empire on earth into a flame that could not be extinguished. Yet Trần Hưng Đạo understood with absolute clarity that anger could never replace strategy, courage could never replace military science, and even the bravest army could be crushed if it charged into the enemy with a burning heart but without a calm mind. After the nights when the camps echoed with vows of sacrifice, after the conferences, the training, the gathering of supplies, and the careful watching of Yuan movements, another quieter image unfolded in Vạn Kiep. Inside a small room lit by an oil lamp, Trần Hưng Đạo sat silently before maps, bamboo slips, ancient military texts, and handwritten notes gathered from years of observing the mountains and rivers of Đại Việt. Outside, cold wind struck the roofs of the camp. Soldiers continued their training, and the distant cries of horses rose through the night. But inside that room, the Supreme Commander was not preparing for a single battle. He was preparing a way of fighting, a doctrine of national defense, and a legacy that centuries later would still be remembered with reverence. He knew the Mongol army was powerful because of its speed, discipline, long-range campaigns, encirclement tactics, and ability to crush opponents through relentless pressure. But Đại Việt could not imitate them. Đại Việt did not possess endless grasslands for cavalry to dominate. It did not possess overwhelming numbers or limitless supplies. Đại Việt had rivers, mountains, reed fields, marshlands, narrow roads, monsoon seasons, shifting currents, hidden tidal flats, and most importantly, the hearts of its people. Therefore, if Đại Việt wanted to win, it had to fight according to its own shape. It had to turn the land itself into a battlefield, the people into its foundation, time into its blade, and flexibility into its armor. From that understanding, the military thought of Trần Hưng Đạo gradually took form, crystallizing in works such as Bin Thursday U Luoc and Vạn Kiep Tong by Trần Thursday. To him, military science was not a collection of rigid words to be memorized. It was survival itself. Every river could become a defensive line. Every forest could become a wall. Every village could become a rear base. Every ordinary person, if trusted, could become the eyes and ears of the court, a keeper of supplies, a guide through hidden roads, a messenger in the night, and a part of an invisible strength the invaders could never fully understand. For that reason, Trần Hưng Đạo first principle was not rooted in swords or spears, but in human unity. The king and officials must share one heart. Brothers must live in harmony, and the whole country must contribute its strength. If suspicion remained within the royal court, if division spread among commanders, if confusion took hold among the people, then Đại Việt would weaken from within before the Yuan army even arrived. Trần Hưng Đạo had witnessed how family tragedy could create dangerous cracks in a nation's foundation. He had also overcome his own private vengeance to choose the common destiny of the country. Because of this, unity in his eyes was not merely a beautiful phrase spoken in court. It was the highest military strategy. A small country could resist a great empire only when every class of society looked in the same direction. The king had to trust his generals. The generals had to care for their soldiers. The soldiers had to trust the people. The people had to trust the court. When those four layers joined together like a tree with deep roots, even the greatest storm could not easily tear it from the earth. But if one link broke, the entire structure could tremble. During the military drills at Vạn Kiep, Trần Hưng Đạo did not merely teach soldiers how to hold a spear, draw a bow, or form a battle line. He taught them how to understand war with intelligence. He taught that advancing was not always bravery, and retreating was not always cowardice. Sometimes stepping back meant drawing the enemy into unfamiliar ground. Sometimes abandoning a city meant turning the enemy's arrogance into a trap. Sometimes avoiding direct battle meant allowing hunger, illness, climate, and distance to wear down the enemy before steel ever met steel. To him, victory did not always begin with the sound of swords striking shields. It could begin with a hidden storehouse placed in the right location, a road destroyed at the right moment, a small boat carrying information through the darkness, or an ordinary villager refusing to sell food to the invaders. That was the art of using the few against the many, the weak against the strong, and the familiar land against the enemy's unfamiliar power. To carry out this art, Trần Hưng Đạo needed men who did not merely obey orders, but understood their meaning. He saw people differently. While many nobles looked only at birth, he looked at character. While others valued rank and title, he valued ability and loyalty. The story of Pham Ngu Lao revealed this clearly. The young man from Phuong village once sat weaving baskets by the roadside, so absorbed in thought that when soldiers passed by and a spear wounded his thigh, he did not even notice. To others, he might have appeared to be a distracted commoner. But Trần Hưng Đạo saw in that concentration a rare mind. He did not ignore talent simply because it wore no official robe. He brought Pham Ngu Lao into his service, trained him, guided him, and from an ordinary young man, Pham Ngu Lao became one of the great generals of the Trần dynasty. Beside him were also Yet Kiêu, master of the rivers, able to dive deep, swim far, and understand currents as if they were his own breath, and De Tuong, loyal, courageous, closely connected with war elephants and the battlefield as though they were part of his own flesh. To Trần Hưng Đạo, these men were not merely retainers. They were extensions of his strategy, special blades in a war where even the smallest advantage could change the outcome. He did not build an army through fear. He built it through trust. Those who served under him knew their talents were seen, their loyalty was respected, and their lives were not treated as worthless. Because of this, they were willing to go into the most dangerous places and carry out the hardest missions, not only because of orders, but because they believed in the man who led them. Inside the oil-lit room at Vạn Kiếp, Trần Hưng Đạo continued to write. He wrote not only about how to fight battles, but how to maintain troops, feed armies, use men wisely, examine terrain, and judge timing. He studied northern military theory, understood Sun Tzu, and grasped ancient principles of emptiness and substance, regular and irregular forces, attack and defense. But he did not copy them blindly. Đại Việt was not China. The mountains and rivers of Đại Việt were different, the people were different, and the circumstances were different. Even the greatest theory, if not transformed to fit one's own land, would become nothing more than dead words on paper. Thus, the military thought of Trần Hưng Đạo had classical roots, but carried the living soul of Đại Việt. Its essence was flexibility. It was the ability to dissolve into the people, hide among mountains, move with rivers, appear at the right moment, and disappear in the right place, making the enemy grow more exhausted the larger it became, more isolated the deeper it advanced, and more desperate the longer it was forced into a war it did not know how to endure. He understood that rivers were not scenery. They were weapons. The rivers of Đại Việt could carry boats, hide boats, divide enemy formations, lead invaders into unfamiliar waters, and trap them within tides. Mountains could conceal troops, hold roads, support ambushes, and make the enemy lose direction. Rice fields could feed the people in peace, but in war, if necessary, they could become empty spaces where the enemy could find no food. Every decision was painful, but defending a country had never been an easy road. What made Trần Hưng Đạo great was that he did not only see the battle before him. He saw the endurance of the entire nation after the battle. He knew that if the people were forced to sacrifice beyond their strength, the root of the country would weaken. If one cared only about winning a battle while exhausting the people, such a victory might not last. Therefore, within his military thinking there was always the shadow of statecraft. Defending the country did not only mean defeating the enemy when they arrived. It also meant ensuring that the people had enough strength to stand again after the war, enough trust to continue farming, living, feeding armies, protecting villages, and preserving the nation. The more he prepared for war, the more Trần Hưng Đạo understood that a great commander could not know only the battlefield. He had to understand the people's hearths, the grain inside storehouses, the boats at the river docks, the fear of mothers sending sons to war, and the exhaustion of soldiers after long marches. Only when he understood these things could his commands become more than cold lashes of authority. They became calls with moral weight. For that reason, his military writings were not only for generals. They were the crystallization of a national vision. At Vạn Kiếp, where rivers and mountains met and important military routes converged. Trần Hưng Đạo built not merely a base, but the strategic mind of Đại Việt. From there, orders could be sent to every army. Reports from the border, the rivers, the sea, and distant villages returned to him. Generals came and went, carrying instructions, strategies, and renewed confidence. In the eyes of the Yuan Empire, Đại Việt might have appeared to be a small kingdom. But within that small kingdom, a living defensive network was taking shape, where the court, army, and people were connected like blood vessels inside one body. When people remember Trần Hưng Đạo, they often remember him in glorious moments on the battlefield. But before those victories, there were countless nights when he quietly wrote, thought, corrected, questioned, listened, and prepared. There were hours when he studied maps until his eyes were tired, weighing each river bend, each ferry crossing, each retreat route. There were times when he chose not to fight, even when soldiers were eager, because he knew the moment had not yet come. There were moments when he endured the doubts of others, because the right strategy does not always look like the courage the crowd expects to see. Military genius does not lie in always doing what others want to witness. It lies in seeing what others have not yet seen. Trần Hưng Đạo saw that the stronger the Yuan army was, the more it depended on speed, supplies, and the terror it created. If Đại Việt refused to fear, if Đại Việt denied them food, if Đại Việt refused to stand still and be crushed, then that enormous strength would begin to consume itself. Even the strongest tiger in the forest would weaken if led into a swamp. Even the greatest army on earth could fall into despair if it advanced deep into a country where every road was unfamiliar, every meal was difficult to find, and every shadow beneath the trees might conceal an arrow. That was the wisdom of knowing oneself, knowing the enemy, knowing the land, and knowing the moment. And that wisdom marked the difference between a reckless uprising and an organized resistance. From the military writings of Vạn Kiếp, the spirit of using weakness to defeat strength was no longer a slogan. It became a system of action. The army was trained to move with greater flexibility. The people were prepared to evacuate and hide supplies. Commanders were taught coordination. War boats were arranged according to the rivers. Communication stations were organized. Retreat paths were planned in advance. Everything pointed toward one goal: never allow the enemy to fight in the way they desired, and force them instead to fight in the way Đại Việt had prepared. When a small nation forces a great empire to enter its own battlefield, the balance of power begins to change. Night fell over Vạn Kiếp. The oil lamp before Trần Hưng Đạo still burned. On the page, lines of writing continued to appear, calm yet sharp like a sword hidden inside its scabbard. Outside, young soldiers slept beside their weapons. War boats rested silently in the mist. Forests concealed secret paths, and rivers flowed quietly, as though unaware that one day they would become battlefields deciding the fate of the nation. Trần Hưng Đạo placed his brush down and stared into the darkness before him. He knew the Yuan storm would be more terrible than many could imagine. But he also knew Đại Việt was no longer a frightened land waiting to be crushed. Đại Việt already had the spirit born from the proclamation too. The officers. Now, it had the intelligence born from the military art of Vạn Kiếp. One was the fire inside the heart. The other was the sword inside the mind. When both became one, such a nation would not easily be conquered. And from the base of Vạn Kiếp, beneath the small light of an oil lamp, a great military art was born, not to invade others, not to display power before the world, but to protect every inch of land, every river, every home, and every voice of Đại Việt for generations to come.